Okay.
Okay, hello and welcome to Minor Compositions. Here we are in the waning days of summer wherever you are in August, and we are joined thankfully by Jaleh Mansoor to talk about your new book, Universal Prostitution and Modernist Abstraction. So thanks for coming along, Jaleh.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really tremendously grateful to be here. And I should say, first thing off the bat, that my voice is being broadcast from the unceded ancestral land of the Seychelles peoples on the Coast Salish territory in so-called Canada, which is really Turtle Island. And so I'd like to express my gratitude for the magnificence of this space, the fresh air, the water, all of it, the whole environmental envelope, and also express my extreme gratitude to Minor Compositions for this invitation. I've been a fan of the constellation of discourse around minor compositions and autonomedia and the sort of network out of that for a very long time. And so I'm just elated to be here. Thank you. It's
Cool.
great.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, it's really nice to hear. And before we get into this book, I mean, one of the things I really like about it is I think there's this interesting sort of constellation of thinking together and separately that your work is a part of coming out of your first book, Marshall Plan Modernism, with people like yourself, Jacopo Galimberti, people who are drawing from autonomia, but also socialist feminism, and this interesting convergence of radical art history, feminist politics, and activist politics in interesting ways to not just do a history of them, which is cool in itself, but also how the conceptual thinking coming out of these movements and conjunctures can usefully be explored to think about things beyond just the history, but things like the history of economic development or gender or areas that aren't just movement histories. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always a delicate balance because I think that trying to apply things with any sort of too heavy of an immediacy in a kind of applied science sort of way is probably not especially useful. But on another level, I think a lot of this discourse, at least insofar as I've been ensconced in it as a scholar and as an activist for the last decade, it really does begin to offer a sort of low-key user's guide to the difficulties and contradictions of everyday life. So there's that part of it. When I did a sort of book launch at Red May, one way I tried to frame this work was as less of a academic piano exercise, which, maybe in some ways, Marshall Plan modernism tended a little bit more toward that kind of scholarship. And this one, on the one hand, is much more theoretical, but on the other, is trying to sort of probe for a sort of social toolkit that would be less reified, that would help to sort of dissolve the invisible reified conditions of everyday life. And that is really, I think, the Italian feminist, the Italian autonomous feminist aspect of the project. So I'm glad for a chance to elaborate on that side of it. I really have no idea yet how this book, Universal Prostitution, A Counterhistory of Modernism, I don't know yet how it will be received in standard art history.
Mm.
We have, the jury is out on that. Marshall Plan modernism and the beginnings of autonomia was received in a more or less art historical discursive matrix, but we'll see. So again, this is just as a way to state my gratitude to you for the way in which you're giving me the opportunity to amplify the Italian autonomous feminist project The reason I put the word autonomous in there as much as Marxist is that there's a way in which first of all, autonomy is, as you know very well, breaking from orthodox Marxism. And then within that, a feminist tributary is also breaking with a break with it's like a rupture within a rupture. And it also recovers some of the anarchist dimensions that had fallen out of Marxism through the various debates of the 19th and 20th century. So again, yeah, part of the project was to amplify this dimension. But I never set out to put a word like prostitution in the title for the purposes of being provocative or salacious or racy or and so maybe this is a great chance to sort of suss that part of it out, to talk about the problem of metaphor that's come up and that I think you had mentioned right before this
Well, that was
conversation.
one thing I did sort of wonder is I think in the book you alternate between saying using the word prostitution and using the word sex work.
Yeah, thank you also for that distinction. That's really important. So that comes right next after the land acknowledgement, actually, as a way to frame where I situate myself physically and discursively. And then maybe it'd be useful to talk about art and metaphor and all of that. I switch back and forth in the book between sex work and prostitution because I think it's important to take a secular materialist view and recognize sex work as sex work. Sex work is work. The reason that I go back into prostitution is for, the most basic empirical kinds of reasons that the artists and the writers that I'm working with use the word prostitution. They don't use the word sex work. And part of it is that all of them, whether it's Karl Marx or Francis Picabia, are obviously trying to provoke at all costs a kind of bourgeois morality that they utterly despise. That's part of the usage of the language. But also, I think part of it is that in the history of the avant-garde, these terms, prostitution, sex work, there are these low-key debates that I don't think have been surfaced or sussed out. And I'm not claiming that my book does that either. I didn't, I see that the very brilliant Anna O'Meara is here in the Zoom room. And I Anna O'Meara is working on the reception of Debord in various new and exciting ways. And this kind of problem around the tug of war between romanticism and anti-romanticism in the avant-garde is a subtext that I couldn't really go into. So I didn't do the sidebar, the digression, where I would explain that in Benjamin's work, for instance, I mention it, but not at length. The sex worker is a highly privileged character. This is a romanticized figure insofar as it is a figure that exits the constraints of standard bourgeois productivist social reproduction. So, not there to be a wife and mother and have 10 kids, blah, blah, blah. And is romanticized insofar as it's an exit from that economy of sexuality and desire. What Benjamin doesn't do, he doesn't go into the exposure of that exit from bourgeois reproductive economies that he romanticizes. He doesn't talk about the exposure of that position, that body, that and the word body is also a difficult one, and I'm tremendously grateful to Marxist feminist discourse for a dialectical vision of the body that isn't a concrete given. It's social, it's historical, it's socially made. So anyway, I think that Marx uses the word, and Picabia uses the word, because they're trying to both cancel bourgeois morals, but preserve them just enough to go into to some of the, to probe some of the fears that those bourgeois morals are predicated on. One of which is exposure to a lot of the social contract that is meant to protect us all is in fact a very tricky thing. And so I think the word prostitution is talking about this dialectical exposure to a social contract in which one is also, or the sex worker is highly endangered. And so the book tried to think about this by taking the optic, the Marxist optic, the avant-garde optic, and putting it onto various contemporary practices where bodies and the metabolic of bodies and embodied time, and not just the body that, body art or whatever it talks about, but the racialized body, the socially constructed body, the body that's forged in the crucible of labor, the debates right now around immigration and labor. I wanted to take all of those questions that I think are signaled in the word prostitution and have us think about other sorts of bodies, which is why I did the chapter on Santiago Sierra and the artwork in Venice, 133 bodies, persons paid to have their hair dyed blonde, in order to suss out this double-sidedness, where this word prostitution is a sort of a mixed bag. Sex work is the better term, but at a certain level, when we rationalize and we make it sort of too dry, we're missing why, Picabia would use that word. He's trying to provoke the whole this sort of panoply of what the dialectical critique is critiquing, right? The ruthless critique of everything that exists, as Marx said in the Letter de Rouge, yada, yada, but also preserve all of that, all of the thing that is being critiqued, so we know what we're critiquing. Anyway, that might have been a long answer, but I think the word prostitution, I ended up using it for expediency's sake because Picabia used it, Marx used it. But it comes out of a longer sort of struggle. It comes out of teaching.
Well, perhaps one way you can frame it for a difference is usually when people use sex work instead, they're trying to become a certain kind of dignity in the labor, while calling something prostitution almost kind of registers the objection in it. And you're trying to register that objection without
I'm
trying.
trying to register that, and I'm trying to say that is actually generalizable to all kinds of labor, even when we least expect it.
Mhm.
That part of the hypocrisy of the bourgeois morality that Picabia is probing and that Sierra is probing, Hito Steyerl is probing, Hannah Black is probing, a lot of people are probing, is this kind of way where in our attempt to suspend our bourgeois morals and understand labor as labor, aka sex work, what we forget is that we need to see this other side of it in order to see that other side, that the really nefarious aspect of always hauling one's flesh to market, whether that flesh is mental flesh or whatever sort of, what Marx calls the sinews and muscles, whatever that is, it's being hauled to market under compulsions and violent constraints all the time, whether it is literally technically a genital transaction or not. And that's why I think it's really, really key that Marx used it, and probably my sense, I mean, I'm projecting backward, but certainly the sense is that it became too complicated. That here was this kind of symbolic vehicle, the words universal prostitution, that could carry all the contradictions in labor of the day, the struggles of the 1840s, before capital gets put together and organized and all this sort of subcurrents get edited out and it gets cleaner and neater. My sense is that Marx and then later artists like Picabia are fishing around for a sort of a vehicle that will symbolize all the contradictions, and then with the hopes that would get pushed forward and then all the contradictions could get pulled out of that. And I think that everyone's interested in this now because we're undergoing a moment where forms of labor are also getting reconfigured in all sorts of scary ways. So, but yeah, that's to that word. I think when Marx is talking about universal prostitution, he's talking about a moment in time where labor is being disarticulated and rearticulated. It's, the agrarian, the proletarianization and all of its complexity. And it's a moment where things are up in the air. There's enough of a sort of a grab where all of the existing understandings around gender, all subject positions are put back into a kind of it's almost sort of like a conjuncture that's almost like a kind of a lottery. My guess is that this word is being used because as you have this exodus of rural working persons in communities around commons into the urban fabric, into this new space, you have half this population that isn't employable at new factories and mines and rails and so on, and so are going into or being absorbed by forms of work that are sort of associated with craft. We have all those amazing feminist social histories that tell us how many women who were engaging in various craft operations, fashion industries, applique, sewing, knitting, all this sort of stuff that were having to make ends meet for their own social replication on a 24-hour cycle. They had to, they go into various forms of prostitution and sex work. But then Marx is using it as a metaphor for labor that isn't necessarily sex work because of that compulsion of having to put time itself on a market for one's own basic replication, and then that becomes the metaphor for labor in general. Metaphor is tricky.
So let me try something here. I have to admit that when I started reading this book, I found it quite difficult at first. And I think where I started to grasp it more was as I was getting how you're using son rethal. And I think, and this kind of gets
Yeah,
back to something you were saying a bit earlier about how will this be taken to be perceived within art history. I
right.
think in some ways, the work you're doing now is less art history per se in a regular sense, but almost like using art history or using particular works in art history as a way to register in an almost indexical way shifts in real abstraction.
Right. That's exactly what it is. That's exactly what it is. I really think that people in general, I mean, come on, who am I? I'm the art history cheerleader here, but sometimes when I'm reading a lot of work that excites me, stuff coming from activism, activist spaces themselves, and then a lot of the language that comes out of it. And what I love about certain forms of language that we could say is maybe the anarchist sphere is that the gap between the activism and the language is sort of shrunk, and you see the relationships in this kind of really special way. So I'm always reading a lot of the discourse that I love so much coming out of activism, politics, political economy, feminism. It often strikes me that it would be helpful to people to pay a little bit more attention to art, not in a fetishistic way or a connoisseur way or having to keep up with what people are saying is good in art, but when they find the artworks they like, really try and think about how those artworks connect to these discourses. So that's exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm looking at works of art as indices of shifts in actual on the ground real life abstraction as defined by a relationship between our lived lives, the clock, and our capacities individually and collectively to survive, much less have enough surplus that we have all the creative outlets and privileges that we have, like writing books and making art. So it really is about that. And I started to notice that more and more contemporary artists without saying that that's what they're doing. It's sort of just what they're doing. They're making art that is about making art under conditions in which it's difficult to make art.
Mm.
And then like an artist like Blake Rain, he's like literally taking those entry level white collar jobs that all of us have taken and will take or have had to have taken, past, present, future, however it all works out at some point or another, that won't be replaced by AI ever. He's taking those entry level sort of white collar jobs, when one signs up for Manpower and gets assigned to those sort of things, and when one is 22, they always involve learning new applications on the computer besides Excel, new software, trying to navigate within that. And in his case, what he did is take that literally and see how he could squeeze an artwork out of it, sort of aha to the employer. Like, I'm going to fulfill these obligations and I'm going to pool something else. And in some ways, that's just Adorno 101, right? Artworks, culture works, they both replicate the constraints of the society, but then there's a little surplus left over to push back, you know. But what happened here was that I've been teaching art history um, professionally since 2003. And I came into it with the categories of politics and aesthetics. And then the sort of dialectical category that I inherited, which is that all aesthetics are political. Aesthetics is a way of politics by other means. A lot of times artwork is least political. When it looks least political, it's in fact most political. When it looks too political, it's just empty slogans, blah, blah. I inherited that. But over like 20 years of teaching, what happens and what's beautiful in the all the time in the crucible of looking at works with and through students' eyes is that they pull out these contradictions that have nothing to do with politics or aesthetics. And it often has to do with the concerns of all of us in our daily life. Like, well, how did this artist make ends meet? How did that artist make ends meet? How is it that the making of the ends meeting is inscribed in the artwork? Like Hito having been bondage model, blah, blah, even as she's idolizing these activists, feminists in the context of, the PKK and Rohova. And, as Graeber points out, the only feminist commune to ever have existed is the Rohovan PKK, etc. She has idolized this while she's worked in this kind of sector that is under capital pornography, although it was once this much more interesting cultural praxis. She's pooled all these sort of histories together and then made an artwork out of it. That's what Lovely Andrea is, the dialectics of being constrained by an everyday world, even though you have these utopian ideals. So in teaching, basically the long and short of it is that when everyone teaches abstract expressionism or the New York School, people always want to know about that umbilical cord of gold, that Greenberg says that the artwork is autonomous, but it has an umbilical cord of gold. We always end up talking in class about that umbilical cord of gold. And notice how weirdly gendered that is. And so over like 15 or so years, that conversation expands. And what you begin to notice are these moments in artworks, many artworks. My book is the tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg. There's just no way I could have handled it, what I wanted to put in there. There's no Warhol, etc. You begin to notice that artworks are negotiating the umbilical cord of gold, trying to really get in there. And the artworks that come out of it are self-referential, not in the political sense or even the old modernist sense of medium specificity. In that, it's about process and time. What are the processes that I have at my disposal under the life world that I'm in which I have to replicate myself on a 24-hour cycle, which probably means that I'm bringing myself to a transaction, a point of sale. How am I going to do that? And within all of the constraints and limits that puts on my creative capacity, and I don't have a romantic idea of a creative capacity. All of our creative capacities are born in our context, which means within capital. So within the capitalist mode of production, the artwork becomes a way to address how to make an artwork while remaining on the umbilical cord of gold in some way, shape, or form that is still generating a work that then has some capacity outside the umbilical cord of gold. So that's what started to emerge. That to me is what Seurat was about. It seemed to me that that's what Hannah Black was about, under conditions of extreme a state apparatus that is violent to the extreme, especially around racialized lines, but manages to convince everyone that it's managing violence. The violence is there and it's going to cure the violence, but of course it generates the violence. And that violence, in the ways that Black is exploring it, has to do with the theft of, the accumulation of labor time over a long durée that is then sort of gesturally snatched back in the moment of looting. This kind of collective value that has been siphoned out of a racialized population, since 1610, since 1492. I mean, we can go back and back, and to try and pull that back. So I know the book is difficult. I tried to offer these little sidebars that I think might seem strange to people, like when I put Seurat and Christian Marclay's The Clock, I sort of smash them into relation to say that, artists are thinking about time as a not romantic time, not cyclical time, not ahistorical time. Robert Smithson would not be in my project. Robert Smithson's model of time is not socially necessary labor time, but that's a sidebar. Anyway, artists are thinking about this kind of time is money, money is time. How can I make art out of this? And I tried to sidebar that with the Markley experiment. We'll see how that works out. So yeah, Zone Rethel. I found Zone Rethel by chance. And I was interested in how it seems like there was a collusion in the Frankfurt School to keep him out for various reasons, probably, to not enough Hegel or something, I don't know. And it seemed to me that his idea that there's a social unconscious, there's something in the social field that binds us when we expect it least, and that this synthesis would be, in our unconscious, but in a place that isn't in our individual, it's not the unconscious of archetypes or desire, drives. It really is a literal place. It's a market. It's where we all have to sell our labor time, purchase the things we need for our replication, put our creative capacity or productive capacity out for sale. This is the place that we all come together, but we aren't thinking about it that way. We don't see it that way. And it occurred to me that this kind of invisible transactional space that pulls us out, that we're all working for, without even knowing it, would be a place to rethink artistic intention. That what's driving these works isn't some transcendental intention. It's the drive to exist as an artist and to replicate and to have something to bring to the point of sale.
There's something quite interesting about that phrase of the golden umbilical cord. And I'm thinking here, if you go into, let's say, your typical, let's say, exhibition space, or for that matter, read a sort of, an exhibition catalog, we usually get to the context is, what was it like in the 1920s? What was it like in Germany? But what you don't usually see is that golden umbilical cord, that central operative contradiction, which is actually sort of almost formatting everything else around it, or formatting how, under what conditions the work is produced. Um, and I think it's more where you're
Absolutely.
trying to tease back into the conversation, because I think that is more important than just like, what was it like during this time?
That's absolutely totally it, because what happens is that there are so many discontinuities across centuries, of course. You know, the way that people articulate themselves, the forms of expression, the technical supports, the medium, it's painting, it's photography, it's cinema, it's time-based media, it's video, it's performance, it's delegated performance, it's collage, it's, so many things happen, so many changes. And those changes are at those levels of form. There are all sorts of other changes, social, historical, political changes, but it's precisely that a certain kind of continuity emerges from all of those many, 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 many changes. I mean, it often really comes down to how the content of the work is negotiating, again, the umbilical cord of gold in a way that is a constraint. I mean, it's dreadful that artists are constrained the way that they are constrained. An important text for me was Claire Fontaine's Ready-Made Artist and Human Strike, in part because when I read it for the first time, I couldn't understand the saltiness of the tone. And it really bothered me. It was kind of like someone who's super privileged and really popular, and sort of like that young girl in high school, who's perpetually snotty, even though it seems like they would really have nothing to complain about. But then as I moved through my professionalization, the tone of it began to resonate with me along the lines of this condition within which, one is elated, is so grateful, really super fortunate and grateful for the work that one gets. But when that begins to pile up or accumulate in a certain way, the time that it takes to then offer the content that one is being asked to deliver, it starts to degrade. There's almost like some kind of weird inversion in the sort of the quantity quality aspect. So there's the moment in Ready-Made Artists and Human Strike where the artist collective Claire Fontaine are describing what it's like to be an artist and feel like they themselves are the ready-made, that they themselves are the thing that's been, flown in for, the 2-hour visit or the 1-hour lecture or the workshop or whatever that is. And it comes to be sort of packaged and quantified in a way where it begins to feel really thing-like and to almost completely degrade or diminish the aspiration of why the speaker, the artist, the creative type was supposed to be there, which was to sort of help all of us get out of the 9-to-5 work mode. That's what the work of art promised. The museum, free church for secular groups. And, it's this sort of tautology of work itself emerged for me as the condition that the artist is always fighting. And
There's
again,
this
yeah.
there's this phrase you use. I'm probably going to get it a bit wrong, but I think it's in the Francis Picaba chapter. We're talking about shifts and abstraction and what it demands of people. And you say something to the effect of like, by the 1920s, these shifts are already larger than can actually be contained in any particular work or any medium. So you're always getting a partial impression or a partial registration of the shift in what it's demanding of you and what it wants of you.
Exactly. So my sense of it is that after Seurat, at least, and then after the generation after Seurat, where there's a kind of reaction to this kind of rationalist modernism. So you have artists like Paul Gauguin and to some extent, Van Gogh, who I think are sort of terrified of this modern situation, this shift toward abstraction and sort of recoil into the space of myth. And myth is really a dangerous thing in this highly this moment of European colony and empire, because it replicates all of the dreadful thing. I mean, Gauguin is an artist who's sort of Despite all of the wonderful works that he generates, he's in a way performing and replicating the entire colonial construct, but it's under myth. Um, so you have this generation that is either trying to picture new conditions of everyday abstraction or trying to escape from it. What happens then as you get into the 20th century is it's too big. It's saturated. It's molecular, it's macro and micro, it's everywhere, it's nowhere. How in the world are you going to picture the abstraction, the social abstraction that capital has dumped on us all? As anything that can be contained in a frame with a figure against a ground. The whole sort of social representation becomes impossible. And I think the real tragedy of that crucible is probably the Mexican revolutionary arena,
Hmm.
which is another a sort of I don't have the philological, linguistic, contextual expertise to probe that. Um, but it's, part of the thing that comes out in teaching is where are the pressure points where artists are trying to articulate the abstraction of capital in a sort of traditional way, that the sort of the Lukács way, in the sort of traditional language that everyone can understand. And it just doesn't, it anyway. So I think, it's often the case that we say that, okay, Pollock is appropriating from Mexican muralism. Picasso is appropriating all of the sculptural works that have been stolen by France from Africa. And then as the young anarchist, he thinks that he's counter thefting by stealing the sculptures from the Musée de l'Homme. But the key thing there is that these in some of these cases of appropriation, there's this kind of attempt to mythologize, renaturalize. In other cases, I think artists are using aesthetic abstraction in order to come to grips with the abstraction of everyday life that just can't be figured in a Western form anymore. The whole Renaissance mimetic worldview with all of its, which is itself really abstract. It's about metric vision. But that way of looking is just impossible as everyday life becomes more and more restructured, and recomposed by anonymity, um, abstract labor. One of the problems this book is going to have is that everyone is going to say that, okay, labor really is transhistorical. Labor has always been around. And Zone Rethel claims to be tracing the relationship between the value form and, well, he suspends the labor problem for far too long. He's tracing the value form. But I think the key thing that I'm taking away is the way in which modernity, aka capitalism, is marked by the way that labor and labor markets change around and within proletarianization, the wage, the clock. And this is why, the long and short of it is that abstraction comes along and hits in a new accelerated way that everyone is trying to come to terms with in everyday life. And artists are also trying to come to terms with, but they come to terms with it through art. So we have this index, we have this, remainder that we can look back and say, wow, the 19th century was a difficult time in France, or, the late modernity of Italy, or, now the way that people are talking about China, that these are moments of extreme ontological retransitioning where abstraction is very real. And then artists are, grooving with it or not.
But I think it kind of goes back to what you were saying a bit before about the sense that sometimes that when art appears the most political, it's not, because it's almost like too literal, too obvious, too on the nose, and it doesn't register those underlying shifts as well when it's actually trying to be less obvious.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the works that I chose, I mean, I felt that I really hit the jackpot and I got lucky when artists that were really struggling with the technical support, the metabolic of everyday life, self-replication within a capitalist totality, also had good politics. Of course, you know, this is a wonderful thing about Georges Seurat. His politics are known. Félix Fénéon has given his politics to us, you know, for posterity. We have enough of a smattering to understand, you know, his domestic situation with his partner, who is most very likely a sex worker, you know, who is an avowed anarchist coming out of the sort of the Belgian kind of scene, the reason that she would have been hidden from the family and yet blah, blah, blah. That's lucky. Or so we have someone like Hannah Black now. That's lucky. Or, you know, Claire Fontaine, that's lucky. Santiago Sierra, I can't speak for his politics, but I think that his work is the most truthful and indexical in its cruelty. So yeah, it's lucky when the artists have good politics, but the thing is that it's really the technical composition that is giving us something about the situation on the ground for the artist and in general.
Mm.
I mean, there are always these artists who are born into privilege and wealth, like Roy Lichtenstein. But, you know, for whatever reason, able to really feel keenly the constraints of the artist within a new register of the technical composition of labor, the technical composition of the support, you know, Ben-Day dots, that whole, I mean, the whole book could have also suspended the sex work issue and been like a history of the dot from Seurat through Lichtenstein and Polka as the index of capital. But no, that's like a certain level of formalist dryness that that wasn't what I wanted to do, although it could be done.
Mm.
Yeah, the technical support. So it's not that I dismiss figurative or overtly political work out of hand because it's passéiste or whatever. What I'm really trying to get at is the relationship to time, like clock time, wage time, remunerated time, whether it's formally waged or not, but the times. And so it has to be about the technical support.
Maybe to get a bit to about the question of sort of, I guess, method and metaphor is, so for instance, how much of what you're doing is what you're bringing to these pieces, and how much of it, for instance, if you were in a gallery in 1930 and you saw some of Picco's diagrams, would you go, oh, okay, I recognize this, or does that make sense as a question?
Yeah. Um, I think there are two questions in your question. One of them is about recognition and legibility, and then the other one is about how this gets explained in a way that is responsible to social historical contexts. One of the things, one of the problems with art is that they're often legible only later. That's just I don't know what to say or do about that problem. Um, it seems to me that often fellow travelers or people who are close or looking at what artists are doing, they have all sorts of ways of sort of intuitively reaching for it, but there's no sort of systematic analysis until later. The other part of it is when you're looking at something in a gallery in 1930. No, I think that's why there are so many crises in the history of art. That in that time and space, there isn't a kind of available language to convey or share something, and so it becomes a kind of it's the sort of Olympia effect or the urinal effect by urinal I mean the Duchampian urinal effect, where the reception is belated, and the first waves of reception are through derision, dismissal, you know, not so much intrigue as scandal and so on and so forth. And then it becomes legible later. The problem is now in a really reified art world where, there's some sense that either that sort of scandal is to be avoided at all costs, or it's supposed to be artificially precipitated. So that's a problem artists have now. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Mm.
But there's a certain, my answer is a certain kind of illegibility that has to be negotiated.
That makes sense. What I guess suggest back half seriously, head half in jest, is there might be a secret hidden role in art history played by David Graeber's mom. Um, David Graeber's mom, Ruth, was a part of in the 1920s. There was a sort of a musical review called Pins and Needles, put together by female garment workers who were in the union, right? Um, and she ended up in Mexico in the 1930s at a certain point. And there was one time she was telling me a story. She ended up at one of Diego Rivera's like parties, and I asked her what was it like. She's like, it was very boring. Everyone was, I didn't like anyone. I was like, "Ah." So perhaps
That's
she has a
hilarious. That's
secret
hard to
hidden role
picture. My
here.
gosh. Yeah. No, I can imagine the Peggy Guggenheim parties that Pollock would have gotten pulled into as boring, but it would be hard to picture the Rivera's ones as boring. But I don't know, maybe it's because I've watched too many um artist biopics. But the thing about metaphor is I think if you're looking at things all the time politically, which is sort of you know, at some point or another, a sort of a representational topological space, politics, or you're thinking aesthetically, which is a different sort of space. It's really hard to get out from under metaphor, but when you're thinking in terms of a kind of an economic space, the metaphors aren't metaphors anymore in the literary sense of like displacement. It's like groping for descriptions. It's the same way that economists love numbers, because those numbers are trying to like approximate this thing. So for me, the sex work prostitution metaphor really ended up being a description of what these artists are doing. How do I bring myself to market in recognition that an abstract transaction is structurally forging me, but still generate this sort of creative thing? And to your question about Zone Rethel's genius is to recognize just how deep the separation between the social agent and the labor bearer is.
I think one of the problems you're wrestling with, this is something I wrestle with as well, is almost like it's not a question of representation. And so, for instance, like, okay, let me take this from a different angle. Oftentimes, if I'm doing an event or something around cooperatives in the commons, I think about how do I come up with an image that represents non-alienated labor, and anything I can think of usually ends up feeling stupid because it ends up being either too literal or it's like how do you represent non-alienation? It kind of like doesn't really work. And so what you're registering here are shifts that aren't really representable in any straightforward manner, but yet you have to find, yeah, something that hooks onto those.
Yeah. Yes, total bingo. And that, to answer your question about the very brief exchange that we had about Federici in some other panel or something, I think it was the Fortunati panel. Why, what is it about Italian feminism that is bringing all these more general problems around labor, gendered labor, racialized labor, so-called immaterial labor, which is anything but immaterial because it's bound to a clock, and so on and so forth. I think the reason that the feminist artists made us see this first, helped us see this, all that you just said first, about not making it too literal. How do you figure value? How do you figure labor? without owning it and making it be, the thing Zone Rethel does is disarticulate class and labor, which is a whole other conversation. But anyway, I think the reason we see it first in feminist artists is that they do what they're supposed to do at home as art. It's not, it's like this sort of estrangement comes easy. So Merle Lederman Euclides, the dusting and the cleaning, she doesn't anyway. She's just bringing it into the space of the Connecticut Art Gallery. Or Marissa Mertz, I mean, she would be doing the thing where she's separating, she's counting beans, that thing before all legumes were packaged. You had to sort of go through them one by one to pick the little rocks or the stones out, or at least, I remember that was my little chore when I was 8 in Iran or whatever. And she brings that to the artwork. So she has that video, counting beans. Or Martha Rosler, the semiotics of the kitchen. I think the reason that feminist art drew these invisible social spaces into visibility is that it was visible, just not to the art audience. All of this came out for me because I was working on Piero Manzoni, who is an artist that makes it clear that negative space is social space. But it wasn't until I left my dissertation work on Manzoni that I got the language to talk about how and why negative space, negative space is gendered, racialized, class, labor. It's a both a commons and an undercommons. I didn't have the language to do that thing that I think Piero Manzoni was kind of indicating until later. So all of it's going to feel too literal, too awkward, too this, too that. And this is why artworks do it through contradiction. There has to be a form of estrangement or defamiliarization or something weird, dusting in the art gallery that brings this unfigurable thing. So to answer your question from before, that's why Federici became so important to me as a way to talk about things that artworks do in a formal register. That was the eureka moment. Caliban and the Witch brought a whole new world of language to bear.
Right, and it's interesting because this is going a bit further afield there, but then if you read Sylvia's PhD, which is on Lukács's aesthetics,
Right?
there is no discussion or relationship to of feminist art practice of the 70s, which is registering those shifts, but she's not looking at that. She's looking at something else. But I think you can actually see those connections if they're there if you look for them. Hmm.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, it's exactly that. It's in these it's the seams or the disconnects in otherwise seamless discourse where you see these things emerge. I think that's what art does though. I really once you just take a brief break. So I've been reading all this other sort of language and discourse, activism, political economy. It helps you see what art is doing sometimes with more clarity when you take a moment out to come back to it. And I think that's to some extent what's happening in the Federici Lukács crucible. Oh,
Hmm.
sorry, I'll be
No, no, and I think that it's functioning as you said before, as a kind of negative space, and you're sort of going back to that negative space and sort of finding things there that you didn't see before, which I think is super interesting. Um, but maybe what we could do is have a second pause to see if any of the wonderful people who are assembled with us have anything they would like to jump in on. Um, don't feel shy. Go for it.
I do have a question. Is it like the open question time or is it just direct responses to? Okay, great. So I was hoping maybe you could return to this concept of the artist as thing. But before I explain, the question, I just wanted to say that maybe the one shame about this talk in terms of format is you couldn't hear the times when I laughed. Because you said some things that were funny and then I laughed, but you couldn't hear. Anyway.
I'll edit back in a laugh track for you.
Oh no. Oh no. That's like the apotheosis of Piero Manzoni brought into like social time, canned laughter. No, but no, that's great. And I appreciate it because, laughter is, we need it. It's good.
But in any case, so I was wondering if, this artist's thing, if you could reflect maybe a bit, and I think you did in the book and in certain ways through the Koch and various other ways, but this idea of what the artist is, like, is it the body? Is it the name? Is it an individual? Like, what makes it, like, does it retain anything of the person, or does it transition entirely into an object or a like brand, a company? At UVic, when you gave your talk, you talked about these sorts of like artist factories that contribute to a name. Like, I don't know, Ai Weiwei, you gave other examples, but there are people who work for them and they're left out of that nameness, and this other person gets the name, but they're not really the person doing the labor. So anyway, I guess the main question is like, with artist's thing, what is the artist? That's it.
Yeah. So that's such a terrific and great question that, it could just make my brain explode, but in a good way. Yeah, that's a really key and important question. So first of all, I think what an artist like Francis Picabia, if not already much sooner, and Seurat, I think what's being suggested in that work is that the phenomenology of the making, the labor of the artwork, is made within capital and within the capitalist mode of production, hence the dots and the decomposition and the recomposition. And then, it's kind of like a debate about what is subsumption, what is formal subsumption, what is real subsumption. What happens in the history of art, modern art, and in the history of capital, and in the history of artists wrestling with capital, is a recognition that it isn't just the phenomenology of the making and the various languages, the medium, the paint, the creative tools that the artist has, but that their entire being has been forged within a capitalist matrix, and that is going to change and affect the work. And so then this question of branding comes up, and the artwork as being a function of the brand, which is something that Yves Klein explores, to your question, at the same time that he's exploring the thingification of people. And so, it's really just a hop, a skip, and a jump until a generation where this exploration of the commodification and reification of people for the labor market becomes something that the artist has to wrestle with as an ontological characteristic of their own being. So, that's what Hito Steyerl is doing. It's what Andrea Fraser is doing. And, I think given the historicity of heteropatriarchy itself and all the reasons that Engels has made so clear to us, this acknowledgement or realization about the reification of life itself becomes more available to women-identified artists than male-identified artists, even though it's coming, it's right around the bend. I mean, you have the whole Buren surface and structure generation that are thinking about people in artwork too as functions of reification. So that is, I think, what is happening. In terms of locating the artwork, where is the artwork located? Is the artwork to be located as a branding thing, which is, I think, the most cynical appropriation of the ready-made that is there in Damien Hirst, Jeff Koons, Yves Klein, this sort of like the cynical nihilist identification with capital. And then other artists that are completely, peeling away, like peeling the layers away, like a good, to use young girl language, like a great facial, you exfoliate all the dead skin and the masks and the trash and the garbage and all this stuff. And what do you arrive at? You don't know, but you're waiting to see. But my sense is that artists right now are locating the work of art in a kind of a diagram almost, among the process of the making, whatever it is. In Blake Rain's case, those very sensuous felt letters that come out of digital applications that he's pulling into the space of the gallery. So where is the artwork located, you ask? It's located among the phenomenology of the practice, some kind of negotiation around branding. And then the body, where is the body? Yeah, well, so where is the body? The same way that psychoanalysis figured it a long time ago, the body is a distributed thing. It's networked. It's all over the place. We're required only through language to fix it in one sort of place. But I think artists with or without the internet are thinking about this way in which the body of the artists themselves is distributed over many bodies, which is what delegated performance is. It's what Sierra does, what Frances Alice does, what Marina Abramovic is in a way, or Abramovic, sorry, when she did that stuff that I gave the talk at University of Victoria in 2024 or 3 on, was about the way in which this authorial body is distributed over these models in a way that is interesting to think about. Where is the body? Where is authorship? How is the body dialectical? But also becomes really difficult. I think an artist like Maria Abramovic, when she sets all these young people into this kind of open, distributive, delegated performance, I think what she's unconsciously mimicking there is corporate identity, Citizens United. So the question of where is the body is a good question, and I think different artists do it a little bit differently.
Thank you. That's really interesting.
It's a really good question. And I have to say, again, this is why I'm so grateful to the richness of language offered by autonomous feminism, because I think my sense from this, this being on the same, we're all on these similar kind of professional networks, is that autonomous feminism has afforded us a chance to look at works of art that are really undercovered or badly covered. So my sense is that there's going to be a generation of writers that are thinking about the kinds of embodied praxis that, say, Valley Export does through a autonomous Marxist lens that will help teach us where the body is. That the body, it's not just psychoanalysis and drives. It's not just post-structuralist, hoo-ha. It's not an empirically given thing. It's this kind of socially networked process. That's what, artists are increasingly showing us, that's what bodies have always been. Hence, issues around gender, around racialization, who is visible as a body, who is not visible as a body, who is visible as beautiful. Since you're coming from the constellation of discourse around Debord and the SI, you know that there are a lot of debates around gender and the SI. And an interesting debate that has come up partly in the reception to Kelly Baum's piece on the Situationist International and sex and sexuality is how a lot of audiences had a sense that there was something vaguely problematic in SI practices, but everyone missed the object, because the object wasn't the objects that the SI was picturing in the film or book Society of the Spectacle. That, not all bodies are pictured in the spectacle. And so we miss them as bodies, as objects of desire, as, so the whole question about bodies and visibility is, I think, really key, and what artists are pushing to the point when they are deemed most cruel against Santiago Sierra is showing us that the world is populated by bodies we never see. So yeah, the bodies thing is a difficult, but the answer for sure is it's located and distributed in a social matrix, and this affects what we can see and what we don't see. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, I was writing many things down. I guess I'm sure there are more questions, but in terms of the question of who appears in the spectacle, I guess in Society of the Spectacle, Debord talks about youth and all of these different things that people prioritize in image-driven culture, and kind of disconnects it from the identity of the actual person, which I guess is just that is reification. So like youth does not belong to the youth. And so, there is sort of this privileging of certain people who are shown, but it's also like it's not that really theirs either. It's not the person who's the celebrity commodity doesn't have any real sense of like ownership over the object that they become.
And that's what I think is going on Ready-Made Artists and Human Strike. The speaker sounds kind of like a salty complainer, but what's happening underneath the salty complaint is the creeping sense that they are not the agents of their being there. But yeah, to your question, that's again, I think why the insight is that bodies and identities are to a certain extent shared. And I don't mean in the dystopian sense of AI and atomized, bots and so on, the phenomenon of the political robocollar, this sort of thing. I mean, in some other sense that, and you touch on exactly the problem that I'm trying to deal with now, is that there's a certain kind of dismantling of the reified bourgeois subject that is a good kind of dismantling that helps us, overcome separation, find each other, share, parse out the social burdens and the social wealth and the social surplus. And then there's another kind that is just utterly fascistic and terrifying. And I think that the key the artwork is trying to find is trying to figure out where those limits, and it's not always obvious to everybody. So again, because you're here and you're in a constellation of SI scholarship, I was having a conversation once with Vincent Kaufmann. I don't even remember. I don't know, because we've fallen out of touch. I don't know if he's still alive or not. But so Vincent Kaufmann wrote a lot on Debord and had this kind of romantic take and wrote a biography. And he pointed out to me at a conference once that Debord showed real interest in Klein at first, and then recoiled, because even the brilliant Guy Debord could not read Klein's study of reification, and couldn't sort of figure out what side it was located on, the left bank or the right bank. And I guess history told us that Klein belongs firmly on the right bank, and definitely not part of a leftist project, but that even Debord would misrecognize that. We're all in the sort of the free fall of the historical transformations between labor and capital and content and form and medium and spectacle, until we figure it out. And I think the only sort of the North Star, whatever you want to call it, really is just a kind of project around steering collectivity in a place where it isn't completely absorbed into corporate subsumption. But that's my sense of why it's so difficult But I think that all of our attempts to counter social abstraction by re-entrenching ourselves into these sort of prepackaged certainties, the body or identity, it just keeps backfiring. You know, we all threw our lot in with it for a while, but it didn't work. So I think probably the best way to sort of navigate abstraction is to continue to explore abstraction.
One thing
I
that
hope
might be
that
useful
answers.
might be useful to begin here is I really liked the work of Shane Boyle, particularly his book The Art of Logistics, and where he's registering that obviously labor is being transformed by translations of logistical networks, and how does do artists and art production take on to and interact with this? Because I think it does kind of similar work to you're doing in terms of like registering that kind of shifts in abstraction. With that, yeah, but
I agree. Yeah. I think there's so many instances of this, and we haven't even all found each other yet. You know, I think that there's a real attempt to figure out that a lot of the impasses that we find in politics have, you know, in a zone Rothelian sense, they have their synthesis or their origin behind our backs in some other field. And I think the more that we all perceive ourselves to be things on the market, things for sale, you know, I mean, we all have had this. The first experiences on job markets and so on are shocking, right? Until we all become professionalized into it. And I think that people in general, artists, writers, academics, were always trying to, you know, come to terms by how completely bewildered we are. I don't know. I don't know. I know that situation of being young in spaces of creative capacity are really the constraints are very suffocating. So
um,
anyway,
yep, go ahead.
Okay. I suppose on that topic of being in a precarious young body, and continuing this thought of actually art being ahead of its reception and certain forms of criticality being recognizable only afterwards, I'm curious how this décalage, this gap in the amount of time it takes to recognize the critical artwork for what it is, also simultaneously affects the self-replication of the artist in the present tense. And I can't help but think about Marcel Broteers and the insincerity that is actually playing into this form of misrecognition. Um, yeah.
yeah. Um, yeah. So two things, just to be clear and kind of objective. I'm saying that there's this kind of a temporal gap due to this kind of misrecognition that happens with artworks that are then deemed or sort of wash up on the shores of history, if you want to put it that way, as quote unquote important um, over time. That isn't to say that that happens with all artworks. A great number of artworks are, you know, they're sort of infinitely replicating the existing codes of artworks. So it's usually the outlier or the swerve that in some way, form, or fashion ends up washing up on the shores of history. And I don't think those swerves can be staged. They happen. But to your question around misrecognition, my my sense of that is that the artist or the time's own misrecognition might in some ways even be a way to preserve. I'm thinking on a limb here with you because I know I can do that because, you know, I have thought with you before and, you know, I trust you. I'm thinking on a limb, but there have been cases in the history of art where even the artist themselves doesn't really recognize the kind of risk they're taking. And to some extent, just for a textbook example of this, not to be too pedantic and boring as an art historian, but it's still Manet. And that's kind of the point in the two chapters, the chapter that T.J. Clark writes on Manet's Olympia, and then the chapter on the bar at the Folies Bergère. And what is being said there is that as Manet kind of comes into a recognition of how he's doing this extraordinary thing, the extraordinary thing just sort of fizzles out. When he did Olympia, he himself was so mortified by the scandal that he unleashed that he apparently didn't leave the house for a very long time. He was ashamed. Or in his more recent work, T.J. Clark mentions that, you know, the Delacroix Liberty Leading the People had very little exposure to a public because they were often jeering it or deriding. So this question of temporality is really difficult, because I don't think it's something that can be steered in a social arena. And again, that's why Zone Rethel is interesting, because he's talking about something where what's happening in the social sphere is not within the purview of the social agent who is in the live time of a community, a society. So, you know, the really vulgar way of conveying to you what I'm trying to say is that it's kind of a que sera, sera sort of thing. I think part of it has to do with luck, faith, event. I really don't know. But it's a good question, and it answers the question that some of you in your cohort have often had, that, you know, why do we often go and look at works of art that we're told that are going to be so edgy and so on, and that just are really boring? Because it's kind of like the time is out of sync, and it's almost as though it had to be that way. That's a kind of a woo-woo answer. I don't really know why it happens that way, but it does. Maybe you have a counter question that will help me get out of this completely ridiculous kind of place where I'm giving you a kind of a cowardly, bogus answer. But I haven't been able to answer. I think about that a lot. I don't have an answer.
Well, I'm intrigued by what you said, that this temporal gap of recognition may actually be beneficial to the work's criticality. And the work that
Yeah,
I've had also difficulty digesting to this day is Claire Fontaine's collaboration with Dior,
yeah,
where it
I
has,
get that.
to this point, it's been satirized in, the Triangle of Sadness, in this fashion show artists contemporary conceptual art collaboration. And I'm wondering, I'm sensing that maybe my hesitation towards this work is like signaling at the fact that something's gonna, I don't know, occur to me years later. I don't like I'm try At least that's maybe the optimism that it's also manifesting in me. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I relate to what you're saying, because, you know, it has occurred to me in all these sort of times where I ask myself, well, in 20 years from now, are we going to see Claire Fontaine as the Eve Klein of our era, where we all sort of got fooled by Dior, you know, and that it was really this sort of like abracadabra. But then, as you can see, given how much I engage their work, that's a kind of a risk I take, or a hedge. But this is what capital does. It has put us in this position where, you know, every single moment is this kind of like hedge against time, where so much of what we are dealing with is a negotiation that could go either way, in the same way that signifiers can go, you know, the old duck rabbit thing, or you know, identities that are forged in a really heartfelt activist social space of resistance to heteropatriarchy just get sort of pulled back in to the market. The problem is that this condition just keeps happening faster and faster. The cheesy, honestly, the cheese ball fried cheese answer is always that you sort of, you locate your North Star, and you stay faithful to it, come hell or high water. But all of these questions are really rocky. back to the biopic question. This is why you see that so many artists' lives are so difficult. I don't think that we're retroactively fetishizing pain, necessarily as the source of the artwork, which I've also been asked. Is it, are we enjoying Van Gogh's suffering? Are we enjoying Virginia Woolf's suffering? Well, no, I think what we're seeing there is that these questions are really hard to ask on the ground in social time. Because, and that's why Zone Rethel is interesting. The social field is horrible, not because people are horrible, but because of this curtain of total denial about the value form conditions where we're always buying and selling each other, betraying each other. It's so my answer to that is it's the reason the cliche of the artist's difficult life is like that is that each instance has the struggles of misery. I don't know what history will say about Dior. I can't, I mean, I think it's being understood as a place where you sabotage that layer of the bourgeoisie. But then, as you've pointed out, well, that layer of the bourgeoisie loves to be sabotaged if it's just for a short party, and then we all, go back to business as usual next week. That becomes a question of duration, but that's also Thomas Hirschhorn's failure. He does great stuff, but it's always framed by 2 weeks or one. Like, what? How are you going to, do anything against the tide of the brutality of the need to professionalize and get on a market in 2 weeks with, the equipment that Thomas Hirschhorn and his largesse gave you for just 2 weeks at the Bataille Monument. There needs to be a temporal dimension to match capital's temporal dimension. I think that's why everyone loved Occupy Wall Street, because they hung in there night after. It was a simultaneous collective durational artwork.
Yeah, and I think that makes me wonder what the temporality of the art world, whether that's, sufficient to address this question. And, my sense that it's not. If museums are under pressure to switch exhibition after exhibition, to have visitor departments collect data about the impressiveness of the big scale installations, that these spaces are no longer adequate to hold the time that is necessary to counteract capital time.
Exactly. So, and just to underscore and support your point, we see this kind of proliferation of curatorial studies, and that was in part put in place to stem the McGuggenheim effect, to have curators that are more critical, that refuse, and we see how hard it is, because that would demand of the curator that they have some sort of agency about where the funding and the money is coming from, and say, no, I'm not going to switch my exhibitions 4 times a year. I'm going to hang on to one exhibition for 5 years. And, they can't do that, because then LMVH or whatever will withdraw the monies. And so you have this critical curating that has really just become this kind of managerial wing of the art culture industry. But again, it's, the barricade and the line in the sand is always shifting in time. And so again, cheesy, but the best one can do is sort of hang in come hell or high water. It's never easy. This is why so many artists institutionalize, because they need the paycheck. And then that brings up other battles. So, but anyway, this, I think what's kind of shaking out in this conversation is that this question of transactional constraint structures everything we do. And it's almost comforting. Anna had pointed out that my book is very anti-romantic. Yes, but it's also comforting to be able to see this stuff sort of microsurgically, because then you sort of see what space you have for the social component or the critical component or the romantic, whatever you want to call it, the substance. You find it. So that's I don't want to be, you know, all the time a sort of a bummer and so critical. Part of what the book shows is that under the worst constraints, creative, interesting stuff just keeps happening, and that the conversation just keeps refreshing. And that's, you know, really good. We're not all robots yet. So I hope that fulfilled that. But yes, to Stephen's point, autonomous feminism is really the engine.
Well, at the risk of being the party pooper, I'm thinking we should probably nudge ourselves to
Yeah.
a conclusion, but maybe I don't know, maybe as one last thought to get there. Do you think, is it possible to think about non-alienating forms of abstraction, or how they might be solidified into social forms?
Yeah. Non-alienating forms of abstraction that can be solidified into social forms. I think, you know, they're at my, well, first I should say off the bat that my idea of negativity is in the sense of negative capacity or negative dialectic or the kind of negative social space that someone like Silvia Federici helps us see. It's not an affective negativity. You know, most of the time I feel playful and cheerful. I love having a sense of humor, you know. I think that these non-reified forms of abstraction are everywhere all the time. We find them in the weirdest places and the strangest kinds of nooks and crannies, and they just exist there. I think that's what Black Lives Matter was. I think that every time everyone takes to the streets, that's what happens. Hannah Black talks about that feeling of joy in this kind of moment of looting. They're everywhere all the time. It seems like, if anything, the trick is to sort of just let them be. It's almost as though the process of capture is what endangers it. So what I like about these sort of networked abstract works of art is that they, you know, they index these things without sort of over capturing them. The moment the over capture happens, that's I think the danger of that's the Eve Klein kind of moment. I don't really know, but I feel that they're everywhere and that they percolate. That they're kind of we're not necessarily assigning locations to, we don't know. I mean, we don't. But when push comes to shove, there seem to be these mobilizations that show us that there are de-reified forms of abstraction in the world. I mean, Occupy showed us how much we could find and connect with strangers. And that's the beautiful obverse of the anonymity and abstraction of modern life. You know, okay, everyone's a stranger to everyone, but on the other hand, there are these moments of estrangement that are magical, to use a, you know, a cheesy word, and that do fulfill the situationist demand for overcoming separation. So the trick is to sort of how to put them into a movement, and also how to protect them from forms of appropriation and expropriation and so on. But I think they exist. I don't even know what a non-abstract life would look like at this point. I mean, you know, what Zone Rethel and the Frankfurt School point out that is now being crystallized in discourse around the Anthropocene is that, you know, nature doesn't exist that hasn't been restructured by capital. So, you know, abstractions are everywhere, the good ones, the bad ones, but we do somehow keep finding one another. So I don't know. I feel merry and cheerful, but in a negative dialectical kind of, you know, sort of way. Sometimes I get worried that if I get too superficially optimistic, that I'll ruin everything. That this is what negative capacity is. It's sort of like teasing out these possibilities of an unreified existence. So anyway, I hope that helps. And I am going to be a de Boer and purchase a bottle of white wine and roll around on the sand in the hot sun.
That
After
sounds
this,
like that sounds like an excellent plan. Well, thank you very much for that, and thanks for everyone for
thank
coming along
you.
and
And
having a conversation.
I know another thing that we share is of course parenting. So I'm a 2 or 3 days parent free, unparent child free. So I'm feeling in this kind of lovely ludic mood, and I've really been delighted by this conversation. I can't thank you enough. Thank you, sincerely. Thank you for your questions, very, very, very much. And I know I'll be in touch with many of you soon. So, ciao.